now, Lowell, the floor is yours.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone here on the panel. Starting with CK, this panel comes out of his vision of the relationship between architecture and the study of the cosmos and Earth and life and humanity, and beyond the central idea of this panel, he also very self-consciously went around to craft a group of panelists who represent gender and generational, national, educational background diversity. And then after he, requested everyone to be participating, he organized a series of discussions about that so that the panelists themselves could develop their common thoughts on this. And I think it's paid off very nicely. So thank you, CK, for that. And then to each of our panelists, of course, thank you for this. Nobuo starts us off with a discussion of big history, what it is. Some are familiar with this and some are not as familiar with that. But one of the themes that he emphasizes was the idea of having a common history, seeing ourselves as coming from common origins, facilitates the notion of common identity and perhaps more peaceful relationships. And then Nobuo goes in the study of big history to discuss the structure of the cosmos, the developing and the evolving structures of the cosmos, of Earth and life and human civilization, which is, of course, at the core of what big history is about. And then begins the discussion of how these structures, which we have inherited so often, and that are used by ourselves to develop them in more creative ways. And so thank you, Nobuo, there. Dr. Tajuddin gives us a profound analysis of Islam. And I would say everything that he says about Islam is something that those of us who come from other religious traditions might seriously reflect on. That how to develop the religious traditions in dialogue with other traditions and with nature is an extraordinarily important theme that he's presented us with. Esther, of course, brings enormous background in big history, having taught this and worked on this at the University of Amsterdam for many years. And she also, of course, looks at the development of the material, and then the biological, and then the cultural development of the different structures. How animals have constructed their buildings and even their societies at point, their ecosystems, using the material inheritances that they've brought about. And then, of course, with humans, with our self-conscious and symbolic abilities, how are we going to go about constructing buildings and cities and global systems that sustain the inherited structures that have made life possible. And this is important. Shan, who has studied architecture and big history for many years, gives us really an instructive analysis of traditional Chinese construction concepts for sustainability. She has, as we all should, have a profound respect for ancient architecture and ancient societies and learn from them, but to then apply them to the new challenges that we are facing now, which it demands of us to be as creative as people have been at many times in the past. So anyway, I think as is so often the case, you know, when I get to listen to people make these presentations, I'm the one who learns so much. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for everyone who's attending today. We look forward to now any comments or questions that you would include in the chat that Charlotte might draw on. And as we think about this really important task of how to build buildings in sustainable ways, and how those buildings interrelate with society and politics in the creation of these structures, which will make our continued life sustainable. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Lowell. So now on to the questions. I see the first two questions in the chat were by Carl-Johan Kalman and CK. They were both for Professor Tajuddin, but I think they've already been answered. So please let me know in the chat if they have indeed been answered, and if not, I'll just ask them. For now, then I'll go on to the next question, which was by CK to Esther. So the question was, Esther, I like your NBC building block process, but resources are limited to build a sustainable society, and every nation is competing with each other to grab the resources for economic growth. Learning from the biological process, what kind of global governance should we have to manage the resources effectively between nations?
That is a very interesting question, CK. But that question, that is way beyond my area of expertise and probably anybody's to very quickly answer. What I would like to see, perhaps not in terms of global governments, but more local governments, is that local governments would come up with these really clever ways of acknowledging that people are individuals in our societies and want to, at least to a certain extent, express that individuality. They want to be part of a group, but their own specific part, without sort of letting them use all of these resources. We have culture, and that means we can come up with lots of other ways to stand out too, right? Unlike the bowerbirds, they cannot go to some sort of fancy school that sort of teaches them all kinds of things. They can also show, and they can also use to allow them to stand out, or go and collect the fanciest plants they can find somewhere and put that in front of their house or something like that. So perhaps people could sort of, or governments could sort of try to nudge people to come up with these different, more creative ways to also express themselves that are not so bad for our resource reserves, just more sustainable. And I think what Shanshan talked about, that history also contains lots of lessons. Because in China, it was also the case. Shanshan mentioned that it was also just not done to go too far in the way they sort of express themselves through architectural gardens. And it was the case because if you did that, you were just not learned enough. So you didn't understand your culture sufficiently well. So that's also a way of standing out that actually enhances sustainability. So I would like governments to sort of nudge people more into those kinds of directions, or at least that is one of the lessons that I think you can learn from looking at building specific aspects of building, specific aspects of city building, the way I did. But there are probably many, many more lessons, I'm pretty sure. Does that, doesn't entirely answer your question, but perhaps a little bit? A little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so the next question is by Carl-Johan Kalman for Professor Tajuddin. And it says, are you familiar with the work of Dan Gibson indicating that the architecture of mosques were originally directed towards Petra rather than Mecca? Do you believe this is correct? And if so, does it have any implications for the reform of Islam?
Thank you. Yes, I had watched the YouTube and 3 times, I think, and it's a very interesting research by this academic. Before this, no one and no Muslim would be ever be questioning the idea of a different place of Mecca, and this man simply puts a very convincing research to me that the place of Mecca is not the one that we see here. Now, obviously, I don't think the Saudi government is going to be very friendly to the research because it has a lot of economic implication, since a lot of the money comes from Umrah or from the idea of this the Hajj, and so I don't think they're gonna give any sense to the research. As to me, as a Muslim, when I talk about this issue, studying Islam, learning Islam, practicing Islam, isn't my faith at all. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect me. Now, in the idea of Islamic reform, has nothing to do with Islamic reform, because Islamic reform is about the idea of number one, of how we relate to the other. And this is the most important question at the moment, because the narrative that is general now, the other is always quote unquote the enemy. And this is being propagated by not only politicians, but also by religious teachers who uses the books of the old and in saying that you cannot make friends and you can never trust any non-Muslim. And because they never read anything else. And so they are the ones now in power in terms of authority, like a mufti, meaning the religious personality as well as the leadership of politics. And so they hold the upper ground. But the Islamic Reformation movement in Malaysia started in the 1980s was by professionals, those who are not from the religious cleric. And that is supposed to happen now, but then suddenly they also are not having anything. So to answer the question, I do not think that the idea of moving Mecca somewhere else has anything to do with the Islamic reform, because it is always an ideological perspective, not a ritual perspective.
Does that answer your question? Well, I don't hear anything. So
yes, it did answer the question. Thank you.
So then the next question, staying on topic of the mosque. CK asks, if a mosque is a facility, how can a mosque facilitate the future city's planning? Or what is your vision for the mosque to facilitate the building of a sustainable society in Malaysia?
Well, if I am not put in prison first, then the idea of the mosque as a facility is an incredible move from the mosque as a so-called sacred place. Because as a facility, then it becomes easier to have an engagement with non-Muslim. At the moment, when non-Muslims come to the mosque, they are subjected to so many restrictions of dress codes, of which space is sanctified and this kind of thing, but which in my research, there is no such thing. The Prophet Muhammad himself met the Christians from Najran in his house, which is considered as his first mosque by a Muslim, and what is the issue there? Okay, so if a non-Muslim can enter into the very so-called spaces of the mosque, the idea of sanctity then does not really come into play. But culturally and politically, it has already been narrated that there are sanctified spaces and therefore this this aspect of oversimplification has come into play, and the idea of a facility is very difficult to be put forward. Now, my idea in my latest research is about social inclusion in houses of worship, and I have written and said that in the future cities, we must make sure that all the houses of worship, churches, gurdwaras, temples, mosques, must have 30% shared spaces, such as toilet facilities, eating facilities, places to meet, playground for children. If we can have that, then in the future it will be not so alien that you have to enter a mosque or you have to enter a church. For instance, when I gave a speech in the in a church, I am being accused of being a Christian sympathizer by many Muslims in this country. Just I said, when you go to London and visit Westminster Abbey, there is no issue. Why is it that when I go to the church to give a talk, I'm being accused as a Christian sympathizer? Anyway, I'm a sympathizer of everybody, the Hindus, the Sikh, because I give talks in all the temples and gurdwaras and all that. So that's not an issue to me, but it seems to be an issue for the narrative of Islam in the middle class and mainstream idea at the moment.
Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Now a question for, I think, all the panelists by Sabine Choic. How to move away from the stereotyped image of the future cities, example given from sci-fi movies. If the past influences our idea of the future, how to help the new generation to think differently, that is, beyond the influence of current images or structures of the future cities. So I don't know who from the panel would like to answer this first, would like to give it a shot.
Well, I'll give you the short first. I mean, I thought I'd give others to talk very short. Yes, well, it depends on the our education system. I've written in many places that our education system, particularly in Malaysia, we create boxes. We create boxes of engineering, we create boxes of architecture, we create boxes of business, we create boxes of other so-called profession. In Malaysia, we are so-called industry-based. And this is not going to be very well into the future, because into the future, as we can see from the big history, you need a multidisciplinary approach. You need some a situation where you can philosophize. Here, everything is based on some deconstructed numbers. Okay, so you depend on some numbers to say whether it's good or whether it is bad. I said, no, we have to bring back impressionistic ideas. And the scientists who are now the leaders of the so-called education system are creating everything into numbers. And this is the flaw. So moving into the future, if we look at university education in particular, that the idea of an engineering person, studying poetry or art and things like that, like what's happening in the United States, that has to be into the future, as well as the idea of the final year project or the thesis that should cross into other fields that would be more of an idea of creating a new generation that is not restricted within a box of specific professional study.
I agree with Professor Tajuddin. I think perhaps just look at as many different things that are as far beyond your own comfort zone as you can. So not just look at the recent few decades of indeed sci-fi city imagery, but look at Nobuo's termites. Look at a culture that is way beyond your own. Think about how you would build on Mars or do things like that. So you have these very different images in your mind coming from all of these different disciplines. And that will probably create the largest space to envision something new.
So
Perhaps Noble Shanshan would like to add to that.
So may I answer
Yes,
to these two?
yes, I think someone
sure.
has asked a very interesting question, and I think that as today's situation, actually we can think of the future not like especially in this realistic way. Maybe in the future we can like build our environments virtually. Maybe we can have those actually in China we also have this trying to move towards to maybe the meta universe, to build all the environment virtually. So you can like if we want to reconstruct an old garden, we can like just build it by digital digital virtual reality technology, so you can appreciate the new buildings, but without using so much energies. I think in the future maybe we can just think in a different way of the buildings. The buildings will be combined with the reality and also the virtual reality, and we will move toward the whole like new a science fiction kind of cities in the future in a more sustainable way.
So I think one of the way to move away from stereotypes is to pay more attention to the body shapes of living organisms rather than human past architecture. So basic form of artifacts are cubes. So this screen or PC or Zoom, our smartphone and websites are basically square, all square. And they are made of straight lines, made by straight lines. In construct living organisms, they are made of cylinders. So our head, our arms, our finger, all of them are cylinders, and they have round and curvy lines, and they are wet. So being wet is good for chemical reactions. But in contrast, basically most of artifacts are dry because being wet means to be rotten and corruption. So I think in the future, there should be curvy and wetter and softer buildings. That's my answer.
Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much for your answers. Very stimulating. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there are quite a lot of questions and comments in the chat, so I'm trying to keep track of them. I think the next question is by an account called Owner for Shanshan. How do Chinese people feel about the demise of the Hong in the Chinese cities? And for those who don't know what the Hong are, the account clarified that they were small neighborhoods in the cities.
Okay, thanks, Owner. This is a very good question because we all know that for the 20th century, China has embraced all the modern ideology about developing and urban plans. So we wish to turn to the West, and so we also want to build high rises and build those large buildings and modern cities. In this process, we did do something like setbacks of for like preventing our traditional city layout. So in some cities, we demolish those small neighborhoods. In some cities, it's called hang or xiang, or in China, it's called hutong. I guess in Beijing it's called hutong. I guess the Esther must know it because she lives in the hutongs always when she comes to Beijing. But afterwards we have aware that maybe the modern way of the development is not so well for the Chinese city. We wish we could also protect the layout of old cities, our old cities, our old residences, neighborhoods. So in many cities, we have rebuilt those neighborhoods, and we have protected those neighborhoods. As if you come to Beijing, I can show you those hutong neighborhoods. I think in Xi'an, they still have some small residence neighborhoods. Maybe some of them very sadly has vanished because of our short sights of embrace the ideology of progress and like modernism. I think China is going to back to the traditional way of protecting our traditional way of living. So a lot of Chinese cities have started to protect those small neighborhoods you like. Thank you, Owen. Owner, do you think this has answered your question?
Okay, so we are almost out of time. There's one last question, which is for all the panelists. I can't see which account asked it, but it's the question is, there are so many animals, plants, etc., which cohabit urban spaces with us and which create their own ecosystems. How could we design spaces to accommodate these ecosystems while also using them to improve the quality of human life? And I thought that would be a really nice closing question for the panelists. So whoever wants to, you have the floor.
Yes. Well, I like reading Eckhart Tolle when he wrote the book, The New Order, and he was talking about the tree. And he said to a lot of us, the tree, when we study, is just about photosynthesis, you know, when you are deconstructed with science. And then basically that's about it, okay? The idea of the tree being something that is part of you. And also part of a spiritual, I mean, in the Quran, the tree is a sign of God, because that is what God created, you know, it's not created by man, buildings created by man. So in our education construct, when we look at the subject, let's say in Malaysia, geography and science, everything is objectified into a certain thing, and it doesn't have a role to you in terms of a special. So animals are looked on as a biological organism, you know, as an ecological thing in terms of having this. So there is not much of the idea of a spiritual connection, not much of the idea of a social connection, like being a friend, like a a dog or a cat, things like that. So these are never discussed. And so with trees are just places to plant and for you to share. So here again, back to the problem of education, in the idea of deconstructing things in terms of into history, into geography, into science, into this, into that. Then you forgot what the hell were we trying to teach in the first place? So the holistic idea of things is not there. So even in the universities, nobody philosophizes about all those things, like what the big history trying to do is to philosophize everything. Okay, so this is antithesis to what is being taught. What is being taught is deconstruct everything, make it into a small element, then you treat with that as if you can solve the world problem by solving little bits and pieces like jigsaw puzzle, when you forgot what was the picture in the first place. Okay, so that is the issue with the urbanization, where we don't have this social spiritual engagement and replace it only with something about economic and certain functional things. So my answer is, it's again back to how we have to review our whole education structure and message into the future.
I want to respond, but Nobu and Shanshan, perhaps you want to go first?
I think this question is just for you. There are so many. Yeah. Yeah, I think for me this question is actually it is a very important question for me because actually now I'm working on landscape architecture, and when we design those landscapes, we need to think about all the different species of in this ecosystems. Like we need to think where those birds can dwell, and how could they pass the street. If we have two separated parks, we need to build a bridge for the birds or for the small animals to pass. So yeah, I think just always has this awareness that the earth is for all the living species, not only for human beings. We need to treat them just as us, and then just to keep this in mind when we start to design, as we design our cities and design our landscapes. I think that will our reward will also improve the quality of our life. Thank you, Esther.
No, I agree with you, and I think there are so many ways to answer this question, also based on your own background. So many great designers and architects who are trying to come up with very clever solutions to this question. I, of course, come from this big historical perspective. So my answer would probably be, well, I'd be very interested in seeing, constructing a big history kind of story. So a little big history, but a different one than I just told you, about how different types of animals evolved in certain environments on this planet for many millions of years, and then ended up in cities and adapted to that. So a story that explains why we actually share our space with certain plants, certain animals, and how that whole story is intertwined. And I think that having such a story, and I'm repeating my main argument, I guess, having such a story in mind also makes you look at the present and the future in different ways, and would allow you to sort of come up with a more integrated approach towards making sure that humans and also other forms of life have a place in the city. If that makes sense.
So it's a hard question. I have no drastic answer or solution for this. But recently, I visited one complex building in Tokyo, and the slogan of that building is coexistence with nature. But that building is just concrete buildings and with asphalt roads. And I thought, how can they coexist with nature through this kind of buildings? But when I look at front pot of that building, so there is a sparrow. Sparrow is singing, and I thought, oh, that's coexistence. And I think gradually increasing such green spots in urban area is pragmatic and actual way to improve our way of symbiosis. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's very thought-provoking answers.
Okay, so that was the final question. I got one more request from Dr. Sohan from Noorcel, who raised his hand. I'm not sure if he wants to say something. If so, you can do so now.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Weirdly, all the talks were excellent. I just don't believe it. I'd like to thank Tan Chi, I can't remember, Tan Chi anyway. I'd like to thank him for inviting me. Of course, it's a pleasure to see Lowell again. But my question is this to Professor Taj Uddin. My question is this. I don't know whether you know the work of Richard Dawkins. I'm not talking about his book, God Delusion. I'm not referring to that. I'm just referring to his much earlier of 1976. He wrote a book called Selfish Gene. Do you think that the shape of mosques and of course other religious buildings is kind of a manifestation of a religious genes? Now, religious gene could be defined as a cultural gene. That's what he defines religion to be, cultural genes. So according to him, the reason, I'm not specifically picking on mosques, by the way, according to him that the reason mosques look like mosques it's because it is actually a religious gene, so a manifestation of a religious person's personality, what godly thing looks like. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say to you. Does anybody else understand that? Do you understand that, Lowell, by the way?
Yes. Of course, I think the idea of this gene, again, reducing everything to some sort of scientific framework is fine. I have no problem of thinking the idea that all religions have this basic thing. I always seem to say that I like what Karen Armstrong said. Okay, Karen Armstrong said that most religions believe in God, and most religions say that they've never seen God. Okay, and that when they talk about God, they have to talk in human terms because humans is the only thing that they know about. And so there is this commonality, and the problem here is that there is 99% about God that you don't know, but you argue about that 1% that you think you know. Okay, so that's the problem of so-called religious conflict, when you get into the idea of you are more favored by God and things like that, that you're not very humble. So coming back to the idea of the mosque, now I'm being trained as an architect. Okay, as an architect, I'm more of a functionalist, a pragmatics, meaning that most of the time when you look at the shape of the mosque, it is based on the idea that the mosque is a place of prayer. And that's why a lot of money goes into trying to say that, you know, prayer is the communion between man and God. But when I studied the Prophet's tradition and the history of mosque and evolution and political history and all that, as an Islamic reformist, I said that no, okay, that's not the case, because Muslims can have this engagement with God anywhere, and that's what the hadith of the Prophet says, anywhere. And the Prophet never created a mosque. Okay, wherever he was, that's where they prayed, and other people created. Oh, this is where the Prophets, stopped, and then so they built a mosque just to honor him. But he never gave any instructions that I know that you must have an edifice. Okay, so when you say that many of the houses of worship are the same, I think maybe it's the connection the idea of this so-called connection between God and all that. But for me as an architect, I remain still a functionalist, meaning that if you look at the political model of Islam, depending on which political model you're looking at, then that's where the mosque comes into play, whether it is a community facility or whether it is so-called quote-unquote house of God, which is something which I don't really favor in terms of my design ideas on Islamic architecture as well as mosque architecture. So that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks. I enjoyed your lecture, by the way. Thank you.
So if there are any last questions, please unmute yourself and ask them questions. If you have to leave, please feel free to do so as well. Okay, I don't see anyone unmuting themselves. So in that case, I would like to thank the audience. Thank you for being here and asking these very interesting questions. Thank you to all the panelists for your wonderful presentations. And thank you for Lowell for your insightful comments. And with that, I would like to end this webinar. So thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.